Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Wednesday, September 25th. Today is day 355. I'm still in South Korea. This is recorded at about 10 p.m. Or later, South Korean time. An update in terms of what's going on between Lebanon and Israel. The New York Times reported a summary of the situation, saying that some Israeli officials believe that the recent strikes against Hezbollah achieved short-term goals, but fear that there's no clear further strategy to bring calm. The Israeli military said that it intercepted a Hezbollah missile that was fired at Tel Aviv, but it appears to be the group's deepest attack into Israel. Iran's president says that Israel is trying to goad his country into a wider war. And the conflict with Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, raises the pressure on Tehran to strike back. The Israeli military says that it has been carrying out a new wave of extensive strikes in South Lebanon and in the Bekaa area. And the Lebanese health ministry says that in the last 24 hours, 10 people were killed in the latest round of strikes. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has fired towards Tel Aviv, as I mentioned, and the vast majority of missiles have been targeting northern Israel. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this Tel Aviv missile was the first time that Hezbollah has targeted the country's capital. The Israeli military did, as I mentioned, say that it intercepted the rocket. So rocket sirens have continued to sound in northern Israel, where more than 60,000 people have continued to be displaced from their homes, as are about 100,000 people in South Lebanon. I've been criticized lately for not telling enough of the suffering of Israelis in general, but specifically in northern Israel. And I'd encourage people to listen to the body of my work. These are daily updates, but I talk regularly about the atrocities of October 7th, the massacres that were committed that day, and spent time with communities along that border of Gaza, and how we have to daily call for the release of hostages alongside of the release of Palestinians who continue to be held unjustly in Israeli prisons. My goal in these daily updates is to summarize the main pieces of news that have happened in the last 24 hours. And ultimately, my argument is that it's in the best interest of Israel to stop the bombing of Gaza and to de-escalate all of the violence. And if I can't convince you to end the war on Gaza for the sake of the Palestinians who live there, please do it for the sake of Israel. And I would say the same about what is transpiring in Lebanon. Violence begets violence. But Mother Teresa said, the reason we do not have peace is that we've forgotten we belong to each other. To continue what's happened in the last 24 hours, the Israeli army reported about 40 rockets fired from Lebanon. Since the morning, an assisted living home in Israel was hit by a rocket fired from Lebanon, but no casualties were reported. 2 Israelis aged 35 and 52 were moderately wounded by shrapnel from a rocket that fell in a kibbutz in northern Israel. One was seriously wounded and the other was wounded moderately. President Biden urged Israel and Hezbollah to step away from the brink of an all-out war in his final speech at the United Nations, saying that there was time still to pull back. The latest count in terms of the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah, as the attacks have continued, is at 550 people killed. Today, over 100 targets were struck in Lebanon since this morning, and today's specific death toll was 10 people killed. A Hezbollah official told Reuters that an attack on the group's communication devices have left 1,500 fighters incapacitated, with many blinded or losing hands, and that is a fraction of Hezbollah's estimated 40,000 to 50,000 fighters. Hezbollah yesterday confirmed the death of one of its senior commanders, Ibrahim Kabaisi, after the Israeli military said that he and 2 other commanders were killed in an airstrike on South Beirut. And Israeli strikes on Hezbollah over the last week, I mentioned this, have achieved short-term goals, but there are concerns that there's not a long-term strategy on what happens next. So the big question is actually whether or not Israel has the intention of a ground invasion into South Lebanon. Major General Uri Gordon, who is the head of Israel's Army's North Command, said the military should strongly prepare for a ground offensive in Lebanon. He said the army might be needed to be prepared to enter Lebanon in a ground maneuver. Iran Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei said that killing key Hezbollah members will not weaken the group as a cross-border attack between Israel and Hezbollah as they continue to intensify, raising concerns about a wider conflict. And the UN said that it is outraged and deeply saddened as 2 UN staff members in Lebanon have been killed in the past few days amid ongoing violence. The UNHCR said an Israeli strike killed one of its employees and actually the person's child, but did not specify how the other one was killed. The world's response, the UN Security Council has convened an emergency meeting on Lebanon. It's happening later today at France's request. And Norway has begun a preliminary investigation into reports that a Norwegian-owned company was linked to the sale of the pagers to Hezbollah that exploded last week. The British government yesterday said it deployed about 700 troops to Cyprus to bolster its military presence in the Middle East. And in terms of what's been happening in Gaza, there's been conversations about how can one celebrate the side effects of things escalating in another part of the Middle East, on the north border of Israel, and things escalating in Lebanon when it means that people in Gaza are getting less bombs. The Washington Post reported that Gazan officials reported fewer strikes in Gaza since Israel has stepped up its bombardments across Lebanon. At the same time, displaced Gazans sympathized with Lebanon but feared being sidelined. A spokesperson for the civil defense said there were only 4 strikes in Gaza on Monday, in comparison to the average of 15 strikes over the past few days. The Washington Post reported the death toll in Gaza to be 41,467 Palestinians and about 95,921 Palestinians injured in Gaza since October 7th. Today, the Gazan Ministry of Health refused to receive a container of bodies, 88 Palestinian bodies sent from Israel without prior coordination or any information about the bodies' identities. The procedures for receiving the container were suspended until Israel provides full data with the victims' names, the time of death, the location they were taken from. The ministry said in a statement to the Telegram today. An Islamic group, the U.S. Muslim Civil Rights and Advocacy Organization called CAIR, C-A-I-R, the Council on American Islamic Relations, has said that they are calling on U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to resign after he ignored assessments by U.S. government agencies, specifically USAID and other officials, indicating that Israel has blocked U.S. aid to Gaza earlier this year. You'll recall that a U.S. staff member who worked for USAID resigned because she claimed that USAID was also denying such. But investigative news outlet ProPublica reported yesterday that USAID told the State Department in April that Israel was subjecting U.S. humanitarian aid destined to Gaza to arbitrary denial, restriction, and impediments. And in May, Blinken delivered a State Department report to Congress stating the opposite. When a senior American official lies to Congress in the middle of a genocide so that the government can keep funding that genocide, he's deliberately flouting the law and prolonging the suffering of millions of innocent people who deliberately need our government to stop funding their slaughter. That was the executive director, Nihad Awad of CAIR, who said that in a statement. In the broader Middle East, a joint statement from the foreign ministers of Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt accused Israel of pushing the region towards an all-out war, and they condemned Israeli actions in Gaza and Lebanon. Iran has brokered ongoing covert talks between Russia and Yemen's Houthis to transfer anti-ship missiles to the group, according to sources, a development that highlights Tehran's increasing ties to Russia and Moscow. The State Department just approved the potential sale of 720 Stinger missiles to Egypt for $740 million, the Pentagon announced yesterday. This is not insignificant, specifically because the message behind this sale is that Egypt will be indebted to the U.S. and what political issues might they be compromising because of this new military deal, not only military weapons, but also significant foreign assistance. Of course, Egypt is significantly involved because of the Rafah border, and the issues of the Philadelphia corridor have, of course, been significant. In terms of Congress and Washington, D.C., the National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said that Hezbollah missile launched at Israel was deeply concerning and that Israel faces a legitimate threat. There's evidence, again, that Israel is facing a legitimate threat from a terrorist group backed by Iran. No nation should have to live with these threats right across their border, right next door, which I certainly agree that no people group should have to live with a lack of security and safety. And I just would say that the U.S. response to what's happening, I just wish that they would feel that way about all people. But the U.S. response to what's happening in Lebanon and the Middle East is unsurprisingly one-sided. I don't disagree that Israel has legitimate threats. And when we're talking about the history of the past several weeks, let's also remember that Israel violated international law in 3 different countries in its assassination of leaders in Beirut, Tehran, and Syria. The leaders who were killed certainly should have been adjudicated for their crimes, but Israel clearly violated the sovereignty of Lebanon, Iran, and Syria in those assassinations. And all of that was prior to last week's explosions of pagers and walkie-talkies, which killed several hundred people and injured thousands. I would encourage you also, this is a separate issue, to read the op-ed by the Churches for Middle East Peace board member of the Friends Committee for National Legislation, Hassan El-Tayeb, who said that Congress must restore humanitarian funding to stop the famine in Gaza. It starts out and says the people of Gaza are starving. They're not starving. They're being starved. Over 2 million people, civilians, are facing a man-made humanitarian catastrophe with famine and disease spreading due to a lack of aid access. And at the same time, the Biden administration and Congress are withholding all U.S. funding for the largest aid operation in Gaza, UNRWA. And so he talks about different members of Congress who announced the introduction of the UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act, which would, if passed, lift congressional restrictions on UNRWA funding and call on the administration to urgently lift its hold on funding. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at that op-ed, which will be out in our bulletin this week. Thank you for your continued efforts. Don't give up hope. Continue to advocate for peace for all people in the Middle East, Israelis and Palestinians, and all who are suffering. In the name of Christ, amen.